One of the theories that I put forth toward the end of the DMT book is that DMT changes the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex and allows
Yeah,
us to peer into alternate realities, dark matter, or parallel universes, or whatnot.
yeah.
Um, I think it's really hard to tell. There's no, there isn't any way to make that decision at this point. um, Obviously they occur within our mind. Our perception of them occurs in our mind. But I think along the lines of, if so what, is the notion that it's not as important as to where these things are located as to what information we're able to glean from interacting with
Same
them.
thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if they're there, wherever there is, where's there? But we can communicate with them and they can communicate with us. And just, that's, it's so practical, Rick. It just makes me crazy. It's just like right there. Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist studying meaningful coincidences. And one of the aspects of meaningful coincidences is what have been called doppelgangers, double goers, people who resemble each other in uncanny ways. Sometimes it's just the way they look. Sometimes it's more than that. It's characteristics they have. And I've got myself a nice, real doppelganger of myself right here today in Rick Strassman. And Rick has characteristics that uncannily resemble some of the things that are my own. When he was younger, he wanted to write a manifesto to heal the world. And I'm reading this from his newest book. It's about his early life and the psychedelic experiences and other drug use that he's had as a youth, My Altered States. Rick Strassman. It's a remarkable read because he collects and remembers so much detail about his life. When I ask him how come you remember so much, he says, "I was in psychoanalysis 5 days a week." He went over a lot of that stuff, and he did, and it's in the book and much more. So I'm writing a manifesto to heal the world right now called Psychotherapy for the Collective Human Organism. So he had the idea, I'm doing it, and he's probably doing something similar now in his own work. When he was growing up, Rick loved chemistry. He just loved chemistry, putting stuff together and seeing what happens. I was a chemistry major, um, and I loved chemistry too. And all kinds of things you could play with conceptually in organic chemistry in particularly. One difference between Rick and me is that I started in psychedelics with taking LSD for the first time. That was my first psychedelic. He started with a heavy hashish and then went on to numerous psychedelics. One of the other parallels that I love so much was that he took some acid in Death Valley. And Death Valley was one of the deepest experiences for me to take acid there a couple of times, which I did. So when I was reading his book, I was able to, it reminded me of things because he was running a time frame that was similar to mine. He was in California, Southern California, and I was in Southern California as well as San Francisco. While he was in Death Valley, he heard the deafening sound of silence. The deafening sound of silence. And he got into being able to hear the space between sounds, which there's a lot in the nothingness that he could hear and feel and experience. While he was hanging around in his unnamed southern near LA college, which I could figure out what it was, but I won't name it unless you want to, Rick. I went to a sister college, Swarthmore College, both small liberal arts colleges, and he was riding around on a Honda S90. Uh, and when I was in LA for a summer, when I first took acid, I had a Honda S90. Trying to get over the hill over into the valley from from the coast was a little push for that S90, as you probably know. And one of the other parallels, and they're only small parallels, is that Rick did the first major studies of psychedelics since the early studies in Canada with Beitman and others, using acid to help people who are alcoholic. But he did a formal study, a very promising, useful, and well-known study now. He has 250,000 books sold on his book DMT, the spirit molecule. And it's influenced so many different people to believe and know that what they're doing with their psychedelics has a great deal of potential use. There's tough reading in that book. There's a lot of data, but he makes the case beautifully how important psychedelic experiences, and particularly DMT, can be. He's got other books coming out, or he has other books. The Soul of Prophecy is another one of them, and My Altered States, which is illustrated. You can see it's got some of the old psychedelic kind of drawings on there. They look kind of familiar to me, Rick. When I was walking around Haight Street while you were taking acid in college, they look very familiar. It's a very intriguing read, and I am so delighted that you have joined me today, Rick, as a kind of doppelganger, which I will add, we're both nice Jewish boys taking acid. We're, we're, who are psychiatrists.
Right. And who wouldn't have become psychiatrists if it weren't for the acid?
That really helped. That really helped. So, welcome to the show. And what do you think of this doppelganger thing as a coincidence? To me, you are a doppelganger for me in many ways. I try to make that point.
I mean, there's a lot of similarities in our backgrounds, that's for sure.
That's for sure. Yeah, that's what I meant. What we are now is a little different. But still, we're psychiatrists trying to figure out the nature of reality that we share in common. And we started talking a bit about a book you're working on, and have been working on. Genesis is the focus of it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there?
Oh, sure. Well, as you mentioned, we both were raised in conservative Jewish, families or households. Yeah, and I went through my bar mitzvah and whatnot, and then drifted away from Judaism study or practice. Got into sports and girls in high school. Got into altered states in college, and then discovered Buddhism my last year of college, and I went whole hog into Buddhism. When I went to medical school, I wasn't able to really cope, and I dropped out depressed, and ended up at a Zen temple in 1974. I was thinking I'd become a monk, but once my depression lifted, I figured I'd just return to medical school because all of the previous work I had been doing led me to that stage or that point. But I started a fairly serious Zen practice and study. So I was associated with this Zen temple for over 20 years. And we finally parted ways over the issue of psychedelics, actually. Most of the junior monks I had met when I first went there and when I was 22, and they were mostly all in their 20s as well. Every monk, that I asked, had, taken psychedelics beforehand or before becoming a monk. And they all basically confirmed my theory at the time, which was them, taking acid was influential in them in them becoming monks. They wanted to integrate, solidify, expand, the insights that they got on psychedelics into their daily lives, their daily practice, and became Zen monks. And this was a lot of grist for the mill over the years, in our personal or private spiritual interviews. And they encouraged me to continue looking at the relationship between psychedelics and Buddhism, especially the Enlightenment experience. But as time went on, and I actually began doing my studies and started writing about the relationship between Buddhism and psychedelics. By that time, the monastery had become a bit more hierarchical and rigidified, and they really weren't able to countenance the mention of psychedelics and Buddhism in the same breath anymore, at least publicly. So um, so that was a point of contention. Um, and also, as I was getting older, this is my early 40s, mid 40s or so, I began chafing a bit under the structure. There's a lot of bowing in Buddhism, at least in the school of Zen Buddhism that I was brought up in. Bowing to statues, big golden Buddha statues, bowing to pictures of bodhisattvas and Buddhas and teachers, bowing to each other. And I started kind of chafing about, all this bowing. If I'm going to be, bowing, why aren't I bowing, to the Most High as opposed to these figures? And I started thinking, is this idol worship? Am I,
Yeah,
am I serving idols?
it is.
Yeah, that's what I kind of concluded after a while. So that, also, stimulated, my severing ties with the group. Um, yeah, and by the by, I stumbled upon some, Jewish writings, which were, very impressive. And Judaism's foundational text is the Hebrew Bible. So I started reading the Hebrew Bible in the mid 1990s or so. Um, I moved to Taos in 2000 and joined a study group, prayer group in Taos, and learned about some of the classical texts and translations and commentaries on the Bible. Um, yeah, so you begin with the first five books, which is the Torah, and the first of those books is Genesis. And over the years, I read through dozens of commentaries on the Book of Genesis, and scribbled notes in the corners, in the margins. And just a few years ago, there was no more room in the margins of my copy of Genesis, and so I converted it into a Word file, and it turned out to be 1,100, 1,200 pages. So I just completed that, that iteration of the translation and the commentary. So now I'm working on shrinking it down to a readable size, maybe 200 pages.
What
Yeah,
did your
so right.
what did your psychedelic experiences contribute to your understanding of Genesis?
Um, well, one of the things of note about the Hebrew Bible is it's a text which is received prophetically, in the prophetic state. And if you look at the prophetic state, it's a communication between man or humans and God or the divine. It's a direct link. It's a direct
Yeah,
communication.
yeah.
Visually, but even visually, the more important element is, the message, and, the message is verbal. Um, and so one of the reasons that I turned to the Hebrew Bible after my Zen experience was because Zen didn't really help explain the effects of DMT on my volunteers, or my own psychedelic experiences. The vast majority of one's psychedelic experiences are full of content and meaning and information and visions and voices, and you interact with the contents of the state. I went into the DMT study thinking that the experience would be more akin to the Zen Enlightenment experience of no content, no form, no emotions, no physical awareness, um, no separate sense of self and whatnot. But instead, it was a very fulsome experience. There were beings, there was information, give and take, questions and answers, healing and harming, all those things. So I was looking, besides for another spiritual home, I was also, looking for a model that was more consistent with the results of my DMT studies. And the prophetic state, at least phenomenologically, is quite similar, to the to the DMT state. It's full of content. You're interacting with beings. There's give and take. There's arguing. There's harming and helping. So uh, I was quite gratified. A man very curious and excited to start looking at the relationship between the fully psychedelic state and the prophetic state.
My cousin Bert, who's in New York and wears a yarmulke a lot, is teaching a course online going through Talmudic descriptions. Talmud is a description of various books of the Bible. And this is not, he's now at Samson and Delilah and the things that happened with him. And it's always when something happens, God intervenes. God makes it happen. There's no question of the existence of God in the lives of Samson and the people around him. And that's a remarkable experience to be describing. And tell us how that relates to what you are finding with Genesis.
Well, one of the things I like about the book of Genesis um, is that it predates Mosaic law. Moses appears in Exodus, and the next three books after that, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But Genesis is chronicle of, well, obviously creation, and a number of other events, the flood and the Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, and Cain and Abel. But the real substance, I think, begins with Abraham. The first, the first Hebrew. Uh, and after Abraham, there's Isaac, and there's Jacob, and the 12 sons, including Joseph. So these were prophets. Abraham spoke with God. Isaac and Jacob and Joseph were prophets. And they lived according to they walked in God's ways without being kind of constrained or guided or confined by the Mosaic law. It was a more spontaneous kind of Jewish living, or holy life. Philo Judaeus from Alexandria around the turn of the Common Era used to write that the law is simply a codification of the way in which the matriarchs and the patriarchs lived. There's a Talmudic maxim that the ancestors in the book of Genesis lived according to, or they followed every one of the commandments or the Mosaic laws that began being spelled out in Exodus. But that's not the case. That is an interpretation or an extrapolation. There is no mention of the law in Genesis. There's only one precept or one law, which is circumcision, and everything else, the rest of the 613 occur in Exodus and beyond. So the reason that I like Genesis is it holds out the possibility of living fully consistent or a life fully consistent with God's ways without the Mosaic law.
Okay, without the Mosaic law. And that is a bit of Taoism for me when you go with what's happening, but we have different names for it. Part of what intrigues me about what you have been saying and have the work you've done is the kinds of entities that the DMT revealed to many of your subjects in your research that gave you the sense that there's more going on here than just no mind, no thinking. And this is what you're saying about Genesis. You can make direct contact, but in between, there seemed to be a lot of activity from what your DMT experiences were able to report to you. And the reason I ask that, Rick, is that I'm writing about the psychotherapy for the collective human organism now. And as I do that, I, I'm hypothesizing the existence of a mental atmosphere that we live in through which telepathy can take place, among other things. And in this mental atmosphere might be the Akashic record. And in this mental atmosphere, the psychosphere, might be many of the entities that your subjects encountered. And the remarkable thing that is that they ran into some of the same entities, some of the same disembodied spirits. I wonder if you could tell us something about that population as you experienced it through your subjects and maybe yourself.
What do you mean entity contact or being contact?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Well, I had some experiences on my own, before starting the study.
I thought you might. I thought you might.
Right. Contacting or being in contact with beings. Um, and before I started the study, I interviewed about 20 recreational smokers of DMT, and um, they all said be ready for the beings.
With the green, the,
Uh, be ready for the beings.
oh, the beings. Yeah.
Yeah, or the entities, or whatever you wish to
You
call
you
them.
you call them what you call them. Beings is good for me.
Well, beings, it dispenses with a whole kind of alien culture, and entities, sounds a little foreboding.
It
Um,
does.
yeah, so beings, is just a description. They are.
Okay, they are wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, but but still, I was quite surprised, by the frequency or the prevalence of reports of beings in my DMT volunteers. It was at least half of the subjects, and they took all manner of shape and form, humanoid, mechanical, plants, even sentient furniture, insects, yeah, all kinds of, I don't know about birds, DNA, these things, that you could see, that you recognize, which you then interacted with.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Um, so I wasn't, uh, prepared for the frequency of those reports. And interestingly enough, the volunteers weren't either. They were mostly coming from an Eastern meditative traditional background as well, and were expecting a Kensho like formless experience.
Uh-huh.
So we're all more or less caught off guard by the by how often these beings appeared. Excuse me. Yeah, I've got some allergic stuff going on down here. Um, yeah, so the interesting thing or the important thing about the beings is what are they doing there? Why are they there? What are they there for? And they were communicating. They were interacting.
With
It
each
wasn't
other.
with the volunteer.
Yeah.
Yeah, mostly with the volunteer. Even when there were a bunch of entities or beings, they were still either aware of or interacting with the volunteer. Um, so in a lot of ways, that's similar, to the to the appearance of beings in the the text of the Hebrew Bible. There's
Yeah.
angels.
Yeah.
The prophets or someone having a prophetic experience interacts with angels. Ezekiel, for example, in chapter 1, very psychedelic opening chapter. There's beings with faces of men and eagles and lions and a bear. I think it's a fairly psychedelic vision with wings and with eyes on the back of the wings, spinning wheels and globes and an atmosphere, a frozen atmosphere of blue, a roaring sound, an out of body experience. The angel speaks to him, grabs him by the hair, pulls him up into space. So it's very psychedelic. Um, but contrary to or in contrast with the DMT beings, the information which is conveyed by the beings or the angels or the angelic figures in the Bible, the message is quite profound and enduring and has influenced Western civilization for thousands of years, as opposed to you give a drug to a subject in the hospital. The message is a lot thinner. It isn't especially profound, maybe even cliched. Like love is all there is, or I have to go to Chaco Canyon, or I need to be a nicer person. Those are all true. But they're not especially spiritually relevant to the larger culture. um you're talking about a collective consciousness, and that reminded me of one of the models that I've used to understand the effects of prophecy and of the psychedelic state, which is derived from the medieval Jewish philosophers, which is the theory of the spheres and emanation, downward, from higher spheres to lower spheres.
Mhm.
It's what's called Aristotelian Neoplatonism, but basically it's spheres. You have 9 spheres. You're the highest and you're the lowest. The lowest is ours, the sublunar sphere. It's a sphere which begins at the moon and ends, in the earth, the center of the earth. So that's where our experience, that's the, the kind of information, that we can comprehend.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's incomprehensible. There's
Yeah.
no words, there's no images, that capture it. The sublunar sphere is, where all of the spiritual action is, so to speak. And you can postulate that both prophecy and the psychedelic state, somehow will allow people to get closer to the information that's contained in that sublunar sphere.
Some of the entities were similar across the different subjects you interviewed. Uh, and I'm wondering how many were angelic like, because they're different kind levels of angels, some people tell me. Some are like your own angel. You've got a guardian angel, and then there are archangels which have some broader capacities. And so I'm wondering, really, have you been able to develop a kind of um, description of the population of these beings so that you can describe them in some kind of categories and with actions associated with them?
Well, I didn't really establish or work out a hierarchy of the beings. I more just categorized them by their forms and what they did. Their appearance, like was it a plant, was it a robot, uh, and what they did. Were they attentive? Were they kind? Were they healing? Were they helpful? Were they giving advice? Were they scary? Were they damaging in somehow or another? Um, if you're looking at well, if you're looking at angels, anyway, in the context of the Hebrew Bible, it's taught that that every angel has one function,
Yeah.
one um, one function per angel. Um, so there are specific angels which are mentioned in the text. There's Gabriel, there's Raphael, Uriel, specific ones. Some are healing, some are guardians, those kinds of things.
And
Um,
you found some of those rel analogs in the DMT people's experience?
I suppose so. Some of the entities, or some of the some of the beings were healing. I'm thinking in particular of one young woman in the study who had chronic abdominal pain because of sexual abuse as a child, and there were hands that were working on her abdomen and made the pain go away.
Huh.
So there are healing beings in that sense. Some of the beings in the DMT state were fearsome warriors, I suppose you could call them guardians or protectors, uh, comparable to Gabriel. Yeah, and Raphael is the healing angel. So I suppose I could have or could you know draw some comparisons between the beings and specific angels. Like in the Hebrew Bible itself, there's not a lot of space dedicated to describing the angels as such. It's more their function or
Yeah.
the message that they're communicating.
Well, that's what you've been doing, and I think it's a really good way to categorize by function rather than kind of name or how they look. I think that's such a practical, I'll call it psychiatric, psychotherapeutic. Let's get the thing done. You like basketball, so yeah, it's a practical thing, and that's such a good way of thinking about it because so much of what I've read is descriptive. And there's some green something or others hanging around. There's lizards and kind of reptilian kinds of things has been one of the things that came out from a lot of people's descriptions. But this description, what they do, is a good analog for what you are using, what you are seeing in your analysis of Genesis.
Yeah, well, one of my mentors back in the day was a psychiatrist at UCLA, Danny Friedman. You may have known him.
Of
Uh,
course.
yeah,
He
and
he was at Yale when I was there.
at Yale and Chicago, and then he spent his last years in Los Angeles. One of his favorite mantras was "If so, so what." If you have these beings and they're all beautiful and far out, so what? What are they doing?
What are they doing?
You know, um, are they helpful? I mean, are you a better person, or is the world a better place for you interacting with these beings? It isn't just, oh wow, but if so, so what? So that's been my approach in translating and interpreting Genesis as well. There's a number of levels of Bible interpretation, and the one that I'm most uh, attached to is what's called the plain meaning, which is to understand what the text is actually saying. There's midrash, which expands upon the text. Like all of the things about Abraham being thrown into a furnace and whatnot. That's not in the text, but it's interesting and it helps explain Abraham's life. There's the elusive, the remez, which kind of alludes to other things. Like, for example, Christians, believe the Hebrew Bible alludes, to the birth of Jesus and his mission and whatnot. And, there's Kabbalah, which is the abstract, mystical, super far out interpretation of the text. The thing I like about the plain meaning of the text is you don't need to be a rabbi to understand it. You need common sense and an understanding of the language, and then you're free to to actually inquire what is what is the text actually uh, uh, trying to say.
Yeah, that's early Buddhism as far as I know. Uh,
Right, it's like Theravada as opposed to Mahayana, exactly,
yeah,
or Vajrayana even.
or what it is, baby, what it is. Kind of that's the way I could think of it. Just what he got in front of you.
Hmm.
And that's the attitude Denny helped you get, and you've carried it with you. It's very practical. If so, so what? That's wonderful. And if so, so what? I still have a geographical tendency of wanting to locate in the sublunar sphere some of these entities or beings rather that we're talking about. And do you think, I do you think of any kind of uh, some kind of location where these things are floating around?
Um, well, yeah, that's common question is, where are the beings located? Yeah, do they exist in a freestanding objective reality, which is just, parallel to ours, or they just, are, brain on drugs? Um, one of the theories that I put forth toward the end of the DMT book is that DMT changes the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex and allows
Yeah,
us to peer into alternate realities, dark matter or parallel universes or whatnot.
yeah.
Um, I think it's really hard to tell. There's no, there isn't any way to make that decision on at this point. Um, Obviously, they occur within our mind. Our perception of them occurs in our mind. But I think along the lines of if so, so what is the notion, that it's not as important as to where these things are located as to what information we're able to, glean from interacting with
Same
them.
thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if they're there, wherever there is, where's there? But we can communicate with them and they can communicate with us. And just that's it's so practical, Rick. It just makes me crazy. It's just like right there.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of studies going on around the world infusing DMT continuously over the space of an hour or 90 minutes or even longer. And one of the goals of those studies is to solidify or make more solid, more consistent interacting with the beings. Like if you smoke DMT, you're injected, it starts very quickly, it's over within a few minutes, and then you're down. You don't have much time to establish a stable relationship with the beings. um, So one of the goals of these projects is to solidify or make more stable the interactions. But one of my concerns is just that question: are these beings from some other dimension who are telling us what to do? Like if you want to do warp speed travel, this is how you do it. Or there's an ecological catastrophe around the corner and this is what you need to fend it off. It's as if uh, people are putting too much stock in the objective independent existence of these beings. These beings just may be a figment of a drug intoxicated brain, and they're only a reflection of what's going on in our mind more or less consciously in the first place. So in a way you could be reifying your own imagination, saying it's a real thing, like you're looking into the mirror and it's like somebody else.
I
uh,
got it. I
yeah.
got it. And so for you, the challenge as you go through Genesis is to say, where does the Rick Strassman like being uh, differentiate from what we might call a in God-like information, where it's
Mhm.
something outside, relatively outside of you? How do you do that?
Well, I think that's one of the questions that swirls around true prophecy versus false prophecy.
Yeah.
And one of the ideologies or the mechanisms of false prophecy is you're just making stuff up,
Yeah.
even though you may not be aware of it. You have a dream, and it's and the dream says X, Y, and Z, and you believe it was a divinely inspired
Yeah.
dream, as opposed to just residual things from the course of your day, or unconscious material which is bubbling to the surface. So traditionally, you distinguish false prophecy from true prophecy in a couple of ways, although there's no clear-cut dividing line. One of them is the message consistent with the text. If somebody says let's worship other gods, that person's a false prophet. Or if it, or if the person is saying, um, don't follow the golden rule. Screw people over if it serves you. That's not consistent with the text. So the message can distinguish a false from from a true prophet. Another way is the character of the prophet. If the individual is a swindler and a cheat and a womanizer and a drunk, chances are the message that they're saying isn't divinely inspired. There's there's crazy wisdom. Trungpa was an advocate of crazy wisdom. You get drunk and you womanize and you're a great teacher. But that's a Buddhist model, Vajrayana model. I guess Kabbalah in some ways it's just very abstracting. You have to do a lot
Yeah.
of mental
Very
gymnastics.
abstract. Yeah.
Yeah, and you really have to twist yourself into some conceptual and some and some moral and some ethical corners. Uh, but the more plain meaning, straightforward understanding of the text would lend one to be able to distinguish between a false and a true prophet.
Well, I've got a way of doing it, and it's a smaller on Earth one, but I have telepathic communication with some trees that are near where I live, and I've got a relationship with them that's been going on for 15 years, and they tell me stuff, and some of the stuff they've suggested to me, you could say came from me, but some of it is like it had to have something to do with me so I could understand what they were saying. That so that it made sense to me, meaning that I had something to put together. It's like just talking to you, I can put stuff together that I might not put together. So if it's useful, that's one of the ways of doing it. And if that's the only place I can do it and get information that's useful, then that usefulness is just the answer to the so what, is a way of measuring what the information might be coming from something a little more separate from me. But of course,
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, um, I mean, and even if it were, coming, from something separate, from you, it's still, being, filtered, through you.
Yes, it's still being filtered through me and has to be filtered through me. Part of what I keep doing now is saying our minds are not only in our minds right here in our skulls. It's not just our brains, but our minds expand beyond our brains. So the idea of a collective mind is what I am hypothesizing, which appears to have pretty good evidence that it exists, that there are synchronicities that seem to be worldwide, for example, that if I'm thinking something, someone else is also thinking something similar to what I am doing. My great idea has already come up someplace else. Those are simultaneous independent discoveries. So the idea of a broadened human mind that can pick up information from other beings, aside from other human beings, like plants, like animals, it just gets extended to me to the entities that we are talking about, the beings that we are talking about, that some of them can be communicating with us. And the fact that I could find out information about a friend of mine from uh, downloading her father, who is deceased. I was communicating with him, and he tells me stuff, and I can tell her stuff that only she and he know. That tells me that I'm communicating with something, with knowledge that I can understand, but it's still separate from me.
Hmm. Yeah. Are you familiar with a book by Olaf Stapledon, First and Last Men?
No.
Yeah, it's a great book. It came out in the 40s, I think. He was an English, sci-fi writer, and he writes about 19 species of man over 2 billion years, and the final, species, they live, 35,000 years because that's how long, it takes, to acquire all available knowledge, but what they do in their spare time is they work on, global telepathy. The entire
Yeah,
every individual in the species is able to, join in the hive mind once every 1,000 years, or something like that. They're working up to it. It's what they do is, their goal is, to have these experiences.
oh, that's what I'm talking about, and that's what I'm writing about, and
Yeah,
that's what I think.
you might like this book. It's, quite mind blowing.
Tell me again.
First and Last Men,
Okay.
and the author is Stapledon, Stapledon, Stapledon. Yeah, just incredibly, creative mind.
And in between is the capacity to have telepathy between two people.
Hmm. Well, Joe Rogan and I were talking about this when I was on a show a few months back, and he was all, keen on the Neuralink implant chips, and there would be no secrets anymore. Because everybody would know what everybody was, thinking about. But I think that's a bit, premature. I mean, we do keep secrets, and we do, experience ambivalence. There are times we love the same person that we hate, and you don't want everybody to know everything you're thinking about them, even if it's just, temporary and, um, a mixed, feeling, kind of bag.
That's one of the ethical things about telepathy is when to be able to do it and when not to be able to do it with someone. There has to be a permission involved, almost like dialing them up from a distance and saying, "Hey, can we talk?" But when people are talking, and I'm looking at the new human, when people are talking, this word thing we're doing is pretty cumbersome. And I can see the possibility of telepathic visualizations where I can send you pictures, you can send me pictures, which you kind of are anyway, and that those pictures become and more enriched as we get good at it. And then even across the distance, I can pick up your biofield because there's information in your biomagnetic field that I can pick up while we're talking, even through the Zoom. These become efficient ways of communicating.
Well, one of the chapters in my new book, My Altered States, is a shared hallucination, which I have with my college roommate. We both are
Oh
smoking
yeah,
this
yeah,
very, very strong hashish.
yeah.
Yeah, and you were sitting on a carpet on the floor of my dorm room, and all of a sudden the floor disappears, and we're flying over Claremont, California, and we're steering it, and we're seeing the same things. And it's just this shared hallucination that went on for maybe 15, 20 minutes. And the way I describe it in the book in the explanatory notes afterwards is if you can think the same thing somebody else is thinking, or if you can feel the same thing somebody else is uh, feeling, why can't you see the same thing that somebody else is seeing, even an imaginary uh, or even a kind of hallucinatory perception.
Yeah, why can't you? Because you can. And that's what you and he did. And you still call it a hallucination. Um, and
Mhm.
and you don't know that it was a hallucination. All you know is it doesn't fit regular reality.
Right, right. Well, yes. Well, the experience itself took place at night, but we were, flying over town, and it was daylight. We were able to, to see everything quite clearly.
Okay. Uh, I like how concrete you tend to be. I tend to be a little more out there,
Hmm.
and I tend to accept a little stranger things.
Uh-huh.
Uh, s- so, I mean, I like stories like three people having the same dream the same day, same night, about a 16-year-old girl, and each of them thinks she's pregnant in the
Hmm.
dream.
Yeah,
And she is. And she is. That's that's a shared hallucination that happens to be true.
true. Right, exactly. Yeah.
They can get the evidence for that. Uh, that telepathy is something real. The telepathy tapes is beginning to try to get to be something people are tending to do. Well, how do you feel about the telepathy tapes as something?
Um, well, I just found out about them just like a
Oh,
couple of days ago, actually. Is it your communication among people with autism?
people who can't speak, who haven't spoken.
Oh, okay.
Kids,
Yeah.
kids, 9-year-olds, maybe 8-year-olds, and there's this imaginary, according to the way you might think about it, hill called a hill, and these kids gather at this hill and communicate with each other telepathically. And this is again kind of like you and your roommate. They're all describing something similar, and they're with each other, a kind of communication. Is it a hallucination that they share, which is what you would suggest, and or is it something that we'll call something that's real?
Yeah. Well, hallucination is a convenient term. Like it clearly isn't ideal. I mean, what would you call it?
I'd call it real. I'd call it something that exists in a way that we don't understand in this mental atmosphere, the psychosphere. It's where it's an actuality where we can do this and be in that sublunar sphere that's real in the sense of being able to communicate the way we are doing it now.
Hmm. Yeah, well, the information contained in the sublunar sphere, it's everything which occurred in the past, everything which is occurring now, and every possible future outcome. So it's a vast store of information.
And the Akashic record would be described as the same thing.
Okay.
This, and I'm suggesting the Akashic record is part of the psychosphere. The psychosphere is related to the noosphere, which is a kind of creation of the psychosphere. It's our technological thing that's a part of our transportation and now the internet, a part of the noosphere. But the psychosphere has been created maybe the way the Stapleton is talking about, that it comes together as minds begin to notice that a lot of similarities among and between them, and that we can communicate in ways that aren't just verbal.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, I'm kind of wondering, maybe you could call that phenomenon a true hallucination.
I love how you think because you're bringing me down to like Danny Friedman. I mean, I didn't know him very well, but he was a very down to earth kind of guy, trying to be practical when he was at Yale and, as chairman of psychiatry. Like it was like, okay, I got it. Uh,
Yeah, he was well, well, concrete. Well, there was a Zen teacher, Japanese, went to China, came back to Japan. His name was Dogen. And one of the books about Dogen is um, Dogen, the mystical realist, which I really liked.
I really like that too. And you and I might mean different things by that, but I think this is a place for us to end today. The two mystical realists with two different versions of the same idea. That's again, again a bit of a doppelganger, but a little bit of a different sort of doppelganger. Rick, this is such a pleasure, and I'm so glad you agreed to talk with me. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. It was great. It was fun.
Really fun.